Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo, and specifically, we're going to finish up our first GetInfoWithValidation function. In an earlier video, we built the function that accepted an array of strings known as our arguments that were passed actually to our main, and then our main just simply passes it on to our little helper function. And then we talked about some of the rules that we wanted to apply to our fields. First name, for instance, wanted to be greater than 0, last name greater than 0. The Blazor ID would technically need to be greater than 8 because we wanted to check for the @uab.edu. And then we had some ranges of values for our valid integers and our valid double. And then last time we looked at how we would capture the exception that was thrown in the event that we tried to parse something that was in fact not an integer or not a double. And where we left off last time was showing that we could in fact capture the exception, print the exception to the console, and then provide some message to the user to indicate that the value needed to be numeric. And then ultimately, we would return results equal to false if there was some problem with the validation of any of our fields. Now, the part that we didn't handle that we want to come back and visit real quick is that inside of our try catch block, or inside of our results equal to true block, we still need to verify the age and the height. And so we've got a couple of different ways that we could go about doing this. Again, I left this for a separate video because what we're going to do is we're going to see that in addition to the exceptions that are being thrown from Java, we can actually throw our own exceptions. And so to understand what I'm talking about here, let's dig a little bit deeper into our age. And if you recall, we had some basic rules that it had to be greater than 0 or less than 123. And so what we want to do is we want to set up an if statement. We can do a compound if statement, and we want to check to see if our age is in fact less than or equal to 0, or if our age is greater than or equal to 123, then basically what we have is we have an invalid age. Now, in earlier examples, what we would do is we would simply print a message out to the console, as well as changing our results from true to false. But I'd like for us to do a little bit differently here. And so under the else branch, basically we're going to, in fact, do nothing because we're going to assume that the age is valid. But here in the true branch of this if statement, in other words, if either of these conditions have essentially failed to be met, then what we want to do is we actually want to throw then a new exception. And in the constructors for the exception, if you take a look at it, you've actually got the ability to specify then a message. And so in this case, what we want to do is throw the exception. This is error, invalid, age. And now what will happen is our own catch block will catch our exception that we threw. And again, we can refine the message a little bit. We will ultimately want to refine how we print the message using the ex.toString, possibly even arguably refine than what this print line looks like. But we can do the same thing now for the height, in that we'll simply check to see if our height was in fact less than or equal to 0, or our height was greater than 108, in which case we had an invalid height. Under the else branch, we want to do nothing. But in the true branch, we simply want to throw a new exception. And in this case, we're just going to say error, invalid height. Now, before we go too far into throwing exceptions, I just want to point out that you should try to avoid using exceptions for pure base error handling. In other words, if we know what range of values we should be accepting, and if we can predict the scenario, then we want to avoid using exceptions because they're relatively expensive from a computation standpoint. But in this particular case, since we're already seeing a scenario where we are using a try-catch, it probably is forgivable for us to just go ahead and leverage that and to throw an exception when we have a problem with our parsing or with a validation. The other thing that we will take a look at in later videos is there are other types of exceptions. For right now, I'm just throwing a generic exception. We can also refine then what types of exceptions we catch. Again, we're wanting to keep this one pretty simple. At this point, then we'll go ahead and build it. And what we can do is we can come out now to our command line and we will run the overload that accepts multiple pieces of information. Let me give my first name, my last name, my email address. And then I'll start off by putting in valid information just to make sure that it's still working and that we haven't broken anything. And sure enough, my return value is true. But now what we can do is we can also put in some values that did not make sense. For instance, -1 for my age. And you'll see here that I have thrown my own exception, my job@outlying.exception, followed with the error invalid age message that I passed along to the constructor for the exception. And I have my error, please provide valid numeric values. Again, that was in our catch block, which you see down here. And we can do the same check now, not only for the age, but then also for the height. And again, you can see here we have a better message here, error invalid height, as well as please provide valid numeric values. And in both cases, when an invalid value was passed to our application, we not only let the parse int and parse double do its job, but then when we saw that the value was outside of our acceptable range, we threw an exception of our own, and we ended up catching one of 4 possible exceptions, or at least 4 possible sources for exceptions. We'll take a look at the different types of exceptions again in a later video. And again, to reinforce, by the point at which you get here, where your results are equal to true, and you're simply assigning these values to the fields, then the other 2 values, particularly the age and the height, have already been correctly assigned. So hopefully you found this little addendum video useful. As always, if you've got any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.